Thank you, Peter, and thank you to all the people who invited me to give this talk. Hope I have something interesting to say. Like the so-called public intellectuals of Europe, the American pragmatists of the 19th century came down out of their academic cloister to comment on pressing social and political issues of the day. Not content to work in isolation on abstract problems in logic, metaphysics, or ethics, a thinker like William James spoke out in public forums on American imperialism in the Philippines and in Cuba, educational reform, freedom of experimentation in medicine, and the evils of alcohol abuse. James was a mugwump, or a dissident Republican, and on occasion, even in his professional philosophical writings, he took jabs at the corrupt political systems of the northeastern United States and praised the democratic, anti-special interest reformer Grover Cleveland. Moreover, pragmatism in general is a historicist approach to philosophy, one that explains knowledge and even truth in terms of historical processes involving all kinds of concrete contingencies in our ground-level human lives. All the different pragmatists considered contingent biological, social, psychological, and even economic and political facts in their story of human thinking and how it works. And when James identified truth as the collection of beliefs that worked satisfactorily, he meant to include satisfactions associated with improved political and social life. In fact, one of James's most striking criticisms of his friend and colleague Josiah Royce reflected the connection James saw between truth and political interests. In the first of the Pragmatism lectures, James endorsed a passage written by the anarchist Morrison I. Swift in his pamphlet Human Submission. Swift cited news reporters' accounts of the struggles and miserable deaths of several working men in northern cities. Among those accounts was the grim story of John Corcoran, a clerk who committed suicide by drinking acid after getting sick, losing his job, and coming home to find his family without food and evicted from their tenement. Swift observed that, quote, "The records of many more such cases lie before me. These few I cite as an interpretation of the universe. The very presence of ill in the temporal order is the condition of the perfection of the eternal order," writes Professor Royce. "The absolute is the richer for every discord and for all the diversity which it embraces," says F.H. Bradley. He means that these slain men make the universe richer, and that is philosophy. But while Professors Royce and Bradley and a whole host of guileless, thorough-fed thinkers are unveiling reality and the absolute and explaining away evil and pain, this is the condition of the only beings known to us anywhere in the universe with a developed consciousness of what the universe is. The philosophers are dealing in shades, while those who live and feel know truth. End quote. And that's Swift, as quoted by James. James wanted to challenge these guileless, thorough-fed thinkers, including Royce. He set out to offer, by contrast, an empiricist theory of truth that took into account the real and sometimes bitter experiences of particular individuals. A Roycean rationalistic and absolutist view, as James saw it, dismissed our experiences, including our experiences of the sometimes obscenely vicious socio-political world, and it called our attention instead to what logic told us must be true. Logic presented us with a rational way of knowing the world, and it thereby showed us a world that was itself rational, a world that made logical sense, a world not properly understood to be full of such irrationalities as pointless human suffering. In short, it showed us a world that might have been created by, and that could even be identified with, a wise, omnipresent, and benevolent God. According to this kind of picture, a political world in which innocent individuals experienced illness, poverty, and despair just couldn't be the real world. James's absolutism and empiricism attacks Royce's kind of Hegelian rationalistic idealism by associating it with what he called prigs, who are too morally good for the disorderly world we really live in. James says, quote, "Certainly, to my personal knowledge, all Hegelians are not prigs, but I somehow feel as if all prigs ought to end if developed by becoming Hegelians. There is a story of two clergymen asked by mistake to conduct the same funeral. One came first, and it got no farther than 'I am the resurrection and the life,' when the other entered. 'I am the resurrection and the life,' cried the latter." The through-and-through philosophy, as it actually exists, reminds many of us of that clergyman. It seems too buttoned up and white-chokered and clean-shaven a thing to speak in the name of the vast, slow-breathing, unconscious cosmos with its dread abysses and unknown tides." Unquote. James wants to leave through and through all unifying rationalism behind and bring the grubby particulars of real life, including political life, back into philosophy. Thus, he offers a theory that understands knowledge, truth, and even reality in terms of what we experience. Pragmatic truth does not give us an atemporal knowledge of an eternal rational reality. Instead, it is a tool for changing concrete realities like those of starving, freezing workers and their families. It is a device for making rationality, not finding it. However, despite the real-world brass-tacks focus of pragmatism, there seems to be a growing consensus that the pragmatists, including James, did not pay quite enough attention to political facts. If they had, the story goes, they would have had more to say about the phenomena of race, class, and gender in their philosophical theorizing. This country was beset in the 19th and early 20th centuries by specific and screamingly obvious problems like lynching, suppression of minority voting, labor exploitation, and exploitation of women inside and outside the family. According to works like Garrison and Madden's William James Warts and All, Cornel West's The American Evasion of Philosophy, Louis Menand's Metaphysical Club, and a number of the essays in Lawson and Koch's recent volume, Pragmatism and the Problem of Race, the pragmatists had little of value to say about these concrete matters. They brought American philosophy to the verge of engagement with these problems, and then, at the last moment, out of tameness and conservative professionalism, they backed away from them and were content to keep debating the nature of knowledge, truth, thought, and reality. If Menand is right, the pragmatist's great intellectual contribution consisted in a view of ideas as tools that could be used to avoid social conflicts like the Civil War. Pragmatism would help keep things from getting too violent and revolutionary, even in the face of moral outrages like slavery, by helping all of us communicate and compromise. The great historicist philosophers of Europe, Hegel and Marx, by contrast, had not only understood knowledge and the real in terms of historical circumstances, they'd also led movements of reform and revolution. Their philosophical views had been specific enough to change the way life was actually lived, but the pragmatists remained pure theorists and changed next to nothing in American life. Gramsci was correct to praise them for motivating the Rotary Club and not much else. Curiously, just as James and the pragmatists' reputation as politically realistic thinkers seems to be setting on the horizon, the star of Josiah Royce, the activist scholar, is rising. Jacqueline Kegley and Elizabeth Duquette have recently written studies of Royce's theory of race and his very concrete suggestions for bettering racial understanding in the Americas. Royce's 1905 essay, Race Questions and Prejudices, criticizes essentialist views of race, declaring that, quote, in dealing with races, in defining what their supposedly unchangeable characteristics are, we are all prone to take for an essential race characteristic what is a transient incident or a product of special social conditions, unquote. Kegley seems to me to overstate things a little when she says that Royce is clearly affirming a non-essentialist view here, since he is claiming only that people who make racial rankings and put themselves at the top are prone to mistake social accidents for natural essences. Indeed, Royce tells us that he has no doubt, quote, that some races are more teachable than others, unquote, and thus more suited to civilization. He's just not sure, given our flawed data, which races are the more teachable ones. The Japanese give some signs of being superior to whites. The Germans gave up barbarism only after long exposure to the more or less benevolent Romans. Royce is willing to wait for scientists to tell us once and for all whether racial characters are real essential things. But in the meantime, he does offer good reasons to regard the idea of racial superiority skeptically, including the observation that much of what has passed for racial science so far has been a lot of self-congratulatory just-so storytelling. Still, though Royce's Race Questions and Prejudices is in many ways admirably open-minded and progressive, it is in just as many ways disappointingly complacent. Royce is audacious enough to ask whether a white peril rather than a yellow or a black peril is the bigger menace to civilization. But in a breathtaking oversight, he neglects to acknowledge the viciousness of the white peril as it was in fact working out its rage on the blacks of the South. Royce mentions lynching only once, in what is not exactly a ringing denunciation. Quote, when I hear the complaint of the Southerner that the race problem is such as constantly to endanger the safety of his home, I now feel disposed to say, the problem that endangers the sanctity of your homes and that is said sometimes to make lynching a necessity is not a race problem. It is an administrative problem. You have never organized a country constabulary, unquote. No descriptions of lynching as a terroristic practice from the bowels of hell. No moral outrage at the use of blowtorches, heavy chains, and meat hooks on defenseless human beings convicted of, and sometimes actually suspected of, no crime. No expression of bewilderment and horror at the cultural practice in which entire white families came out for a wholesome day of sadism featuring torture, murder, and the scent of burning human flesh. None of that. Instead, Royce offers only a modest suggestion to, quote, our Southern friends, unquote, that perhaps the most efficient way to keep the Negroes in line while teaching them civilization is to turn enforcement of the laws among them over to them, as the British have done in Jamaica. Not, of course, that any white man ever need submit to a black policeman's commands, even if the Southerners take this chummy bit of counsel. Royce notes that, quote, if it is revolting to you to see black men possessed of the authority of a country constabulary, you can limit their authority to a control over their own race, unquote. I'm skeptical of Elizabeth Duquette's analysis, according to which Royce intentionally left aside the graphic details of the Southerners' twisted and sickening assaults on black bodies because he wanted to get the discussion up on a higher ethical plane. Royce regarded expressions of outrage and appeals to gut feelings of sympathy as something other than moral appeals, and he would have thought that the best way to attack racism was to attack it instead in the abstract, trying to replace the particular racial bonds and antipathies that had led to brutality with loyalty to loyalty. Neither a pure emotion neither a mere emotion nor a pure and barren abstraction like a Kantian categorical imperative. Loyalty, Royce's main moral motive, revealed our duties to one another as matters of commitments made to communities large and small in the course of life. And Royce, the rationalist anti-racist, might well be expected to appeal to duty rather than to impulses of outrage in his efforts to get Southerners or anyone else to pull themselves up out of a mob mentality. However, this is hardly evidence that Royce had paid much attention at all to the actual details of the terror campaigns mounted against blacks by whites in the South, and the chatty, buddy-buddy tone of his address to his Southern friends makes it hard to imagine that Royce knew or was much concerned with those details. He seems exactly as worried about how revolted whites may be by black policemen as he is about the occasional lynching. Neither seems any more than another matter to consider in the administrative project of racial management. Of course, Royce was and could be no more than a human being of his time and place. And while he would have seemed to us a much more admirable human being had he seen the moral truth a bit more clearly and expressed it with more force, he was in fact trying in his way to confront lynching and the other fruits of racialism in this work, and this was admirable. And in any case, despite his glaring shortcomings as an observer of the real political facts, I think that Royce remained admirable as a philosopher. James is obviously being unfair to him when he endorses Morrison Swift's empiricist criticism of Roycean idealism, the claim that a rationalist like Royce can't acknowledge the reality of individuals and their individual suffering. Royce is about as explicit as he can be about this. The individual human self and the particular facts about it are real, just not capital R real. They are distinct from other things in the world without themselves being things or separate substances at all. They are real aspects of the absolute, the rational totality that contains all things as aspects. Royce does not say that evil and individual suffering are simply unreal. He just holds, as any religious thinker would have to, that they are not the whole story. He puts it this way in The World and the Individual. Quote, "All finite life is a struggle with evil. Yet from the final point of view, the whole is good. The temporal order contains at no one moment anything that can satisfy. Yet the eternal order is perfect. We have all aimed and come short of the glory of God. Yet in just our life, viewed in its entirety, the glory of God is completely manifest." End quote. Thus, the reality known to logic has to be different from, larger than, what our limited experiences in time could show us. And when we take the larger reality into account, we can see that the sufferings of the poor and our reactions against them are as they should be, or indeed as they have to be if the glory of God is to be realized. Royce compares the eternal whole to a musical phrase that has notes as real parts, but that can't be fully appreciated for what it is except as a unity. A symphony might have been a still better analogy, with unresolved dissonances figuring as the necessary dramatic context for consonant notes in resolving phrases. A musical resolution, distinct as it may be from other notes and phrases, is not a thing in its own right. It is what it is only in relation to the preceding dissonance in the symphony as a whole. And likewise, a symphony can't exist without dissonances that precede those resolutions in time and produce expectations of resolution. Even the dissonances aren't really what they are. They don't get their full meaning, except in the context of the larger musical story headed for resolution. For Royce, the eternal, transcendent, extratemporal absolute is the symphony that our dissonant sufferings need in order to have meaning. The absolute symphony of being also needs those sufferings, and it needs our human struggles against those sufferings as we push toward resolution and satisfaction, if it is to have its full meaning and be what it is, the absolute. Human suffering is real and evil, and we have to fight it for the glory of God. And the glory of God, like the beauty and dramatic power of a symphony, will in turn make rational sense of our sufferings. Actually, it is, strictly speaking, only the performance of the symphony that we experience in time and whose dissonances can cause us the dissatisfactions that are relieved by resolutions. The symphony itself, the meaning-conferring pattern, exists timelessly, directing its time-bound manifestations and giving them their being. And Royce's absolute exists outside of time, much as a symphony does. As we just saw, William James objected on political grounds to this idea that we should turn our attention from the concrete details of our life as individuals in time to an eternal, unified, noble, rational, and perfect, capital R, reality. But while I think that James's political critique of Royce was unfair, it is worth noting that over time, Royce himself stopped emphasizing appeals to this time-transcending absolute. He never explicitly announced the end of his belief in it, but it seems telling that in his 1913 book, The Problem of Christianity, Royce argued that the church, rather than the person of the founder, ought to be viewed as the central idea of Christianity. That's a quote from Royce. Christianity, in that book, is above all a living community that aspires to transcend real social differences and become a universal community of interpretation. Instead of a single, infinite spiritual entity that contained all experiences and thus fulfilled all the promise of our true judgments, what transcends our individual consciousnesses, justifies our true claims, and gives our moral struggles their meaning is this community. There's no mention of the absolute as a single conscious being, although it still seems possible here. Such a consciousness might be manifested by an indefinitely large community of individual interpreters who compare their ideas with those of others, compare their present ideas with those held in a shared past, and look forward to a future in which some of those ideas will serve the purposes they embody. For Hegel, the state is the march of God through the world. It may be that for the later Royce, the progress of the Christian community of interpreters is the march of the absolute, but that is not what Royce stresses. Our religious life, and thus our moral and political life, now get their meaning not from beyond the world of time and commitment, but from a kind of Persean community of believers that achieves consensus and satisfaction in life. Let me close by noting briefly two things. First, this conversion, if it was a conversion on Royce's part, did not and should not have reconciled Royce and James. Even if Royce did switch his justification for moral life and action from a transcendent absolute to an idealized community of time-bound beings, this just made him Persean, not Jamesian. For James, truth, including moral and political truth, was a matter not of what an envisioned future community would finally wind up affirming, but of what actually worked at present moments in real life. James didn't mind the Persean idea of the absolutely true or even the fate of thought, and he even used those ideas himself from time to time. They did not contradict his position, he just didn't need them. Even if no such community of consensus ever actually develops, there will still have been Jamesian truths, so long as there have been beliefs or theories that have been useful to us individuals in our struggles. And this usefulness James understood not in terms of final community agreement, but instead as a matter of what he called the habit, or what we might call the tendency, of some beliefs to get verified or to provide us individual believers with satisfactions. A belief is a tool, and we no more need to postulate final community agreement to decide whether a belief is useful than we need to do so to decide on the usefulness of a hammer, a floor mop, a computer, or a rifle. And finally, neither James's nor the later Royce's level of interest in the particular and the community will satisfy critics who think that philosophy must either lead political revolutions or be irrelevant. While James's and Royce's philosophies both discuss the particular details of life, their focus is not on any particular details. This does not mean that either James or Royce is uninterested in life or in making the world better. In fact, what each thinker is trying to do above all is get his readers out into the world to change what needs changing. James and Royce, in all their periods of thought, argue that our very thoughts have meaning only in the context of our purposeful struggles to relieve human suffering. That's why both think of themselves as pragmatists. Sometimes they point out particular causes of real-life suffering. Usually they don't. Sometimes they argue abstractly. They argue abstractly for the importance of the concrete. Perhaps this means that they were not great activists or political leaders, only great philosophers. Is that enough? Well, enough for what? James and Royce didn't remove all exploitation from the world. No surprise there. Hegel and Marx didn't either, as you may have noticed. I've always liked the line attributed to John Kenneth Galbraith. Under capitalism, man exploits man. Under communism, it's exactly the opposite. Royce and James did not tell us in journalistic detail what was wrong with the world and then lead us to fix it. But they did try to tell us, from the perspectives of a religious believer and a skeptic, respectively, how we might try to understand what's wrong and why we ought to bother. If Royce and James had been better journalists, we would be less interested in their inevitably dated observations. We can, should, and do admire them not for their vivid and accurate accounts of what was real, but for the brilliant ways in which they tried to interest us in reality, whatever it might happen to contain at this moment. They did, in effect, the poet's job of interesting us in our own experience, and then they left it to us to fix whatever might be broken in the experienced world. That's enough for some purposes. Maybe it's enough for ours as we're gathered here today. Thank you.